Good evening, everyone. My name is John Tates, and I'm the event coordinator here at McNally Robinson Booksellers. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that McNally Robinson is located here in Treaty 1 territory. That's the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, and Dene peoples, the homeland of the Métis Nation. In addition, McNally Robinson Booksellers itself rests on the land once occupied by the Métis community of Roostertown. We are here tonight to celebrate the launch of Lives Lived, Lives Imagined, Landscapes of Resilience in the Work of Miriam Toews by Sabrina Reed. Now, this is published by the University of Manitoba Press, so many thanks to them for not only publishing this work, but of course for also making this evening a possibility. It's a real pleasure to have you all here physically, and to all of you watching on YouTube, a pleasure to have you with us virtually. Just a few quick housekeeping notes before we begin. There'll be a brief presentation following an introduction of Sabrina, which will take place just to my left. Then there'll be a conversation between Sabrina Reed and our host for the evening, Alison Calder, who I'll be telling you a little bit about in just a moment. Following that, there'll be an opportunity for you folks to ask questions. So with that in mind, if a question does occur to you, please feel free to just put up your hand and I'll approach you with this wireless microphone. This is not a comment on your ability to project your voice. It's just to ensure that those folks who are watching the video live or watching it in the future are able to actually hear your question in the first place. So thank you very much for that. At the close of the event, we'll all remain in place for just one moment while we transport Sabrina to a table beside our cash desk where she'll be signing copies of this book. And I'll have some incredibly exciting notes for you about the signing procedure at the close of this event. Now, we are thrilled to be launching this book here. As you can imagine, we are all very large fans of Miriam Toews. And if I am correct, this is the first full critical volume dedicated to her work. So it's a momentous occasion all around, and we're delighted to be involved in celebrating this book and its entry into the world. You'll be hearing a little bit more about the book later on from its author in just a few moments, actually. But first, I'd like to say a few words about your host for the evening. Poet Alison Calder teaches Canadian literature and creative writing at the University of Manitoba. She has published widely on Canadian prairie literature and culture. She is the author most recently of the wonderful poetry collection Synaptic, which was published by the University of Regina Press. So with all that in mind, please join me in welcoming Alison Calder.
Thanks very much, John. I have a very brief introduction here. The warm welcome that I'd like to extend to Sabrina Reed, coming to us all the way from Calgary to talk about her engrossing, thoughtful, wide-ranging work on Miriam Toews, collected for us in Lives Lived, Lives Imagined. Sabrina is a professor in the Department of English Languages and Cultures at Mount Royal University. She's been there since 1993. Her research centers on disability narratives within the context of Canadian literature. She's drawn to Miriam Toews' strong female characters, her focus on resilience in spite of great hardship, her humor, and her ongoing examination of the personal and familial effects of mental illness. I'm very much looking forward to this chance to speak with Sabrina about the wonderful works that she's studied and the wonderful work that she's produced as well. So please welcome Sabrina Reed.
Thank you very much, Alison, and thanks to you all for coming and to the people who are watching online. I'm going to start out with just a little bit of a talk on why I wrote the book and how I came to organize it the way I did. So I will get my notes and start by saying, while many people will consider Miriam Toews a Mennonite author, which of course she is, I've always found there are multiple ways into books and into reading. And so my engagement with her writing came primarily because I became fascinated with how she approached the issues of mental illness, especially, and disability. So because I'm a non-Mennonite myself, I didn't focus as much on her as a Mennonite author, though obviously that is there in the work because that is who she is. But I looked at her work from the focus of mental illness, especially. Toews, who has lost her father, sister, and a close cousin to suicide, has consistently returned to the subject of depression in her work, Even her first two comic novels, Summer of My Amazing Luck and A Boy of Good Breeding, contain characters who are prone to mental illness. But a major change in Toews' writing happened with the death by suicide of her father in 1998. And from that point on, her work turned more and more to the issues around mental illness and also to grappling with her place in the Mennonite Church. Her book, Swing Low a Life, came out in 2000, and that was a fictionalized autobiography of her father, which dealt with his life and also with his death. Many of her stories have this theme of mental illness of loved ones. And as Toews has herself said in her essay, My Father's Faith, her father's death also made her more vocal in her condemnation of religious fundamentalism. From a complicated kindness to the present, this has been a major theme in Toews' writing. My interest in Toews' work has grown over time. I gave my first conference paper on Miriam Toews in 2008, and since then I have returned to her novels both in my writing and in my teaching. So finally, I decided I wanted to write a book which covered the entirety of her work and expressed my admiration for what she has done in an author. And I noticed a couple of her early books especially didn't have much written about them. And I wanted to put her whole body of work into context. Since I started this project, I've had many, many people come up to me and say, I love Miriam Toews' writing. So I think that expresses how much affection people have for her work. When I thought about how I wanted to organize the book, I considered a biographical approach, starting with Toews' first work and leading to her most recent. But as I looked further, I thought about how Toews returns to the significant themes over time, and especially how, in spite of the often devastating events that she writes about, she focuses on resilience, how individuals can find ways to integrate traumatic experiences into their lives. I think Toews would say that one never completely outgrows or eradicates trauma, but that people can learn, as Toews quotes from D.H. Lawrence in All My Puny Sorrows, that even though the cataclysm has happened, we build up new little habitats to have new little hopes. Resilience is a big subject, so as I looked further into the topic in Toews' writing, I decided to focus on four main areas in which Toews shows how resilience can be encouraged and strengthened. Then I looked at Toews' novels and considered which of them most fully illustrated a particular theme or approach to resilience. So my book is divided into four main areas. First, I look at home and community, how the concept of home is both a bewilderingly complex ideal and also a source of resilience and growth. I chose A Boy of Good Breeding and A Complicated Kindness for this chapter, since both books look at life in small towns in which everybody knows your name, as the Cheers theme song says. In these novels, characters grapple with the ideal of a perfect earthly or heavenly home. In the first, Toews gently pokes fun at one man's obsession with creating the perfect town, while in the second, Toews shows how fundamentalist tyranny and emphasis on a heavenly home eats away at characters' innate resilience and destroys the Nickel family. In my second chapter, I focus on the road trip. And Toews says in an interview, I love road trips more than anything. And in fact, when I told Miriam Toews about my idea for the chapter, she said, oh, I love road trips. They're my favorite thing. So I knew perhaps I was onto something with this chapter. So the books I chose for this chapter are Summer of My Amazing Luck and The Flying Troutmans. Toews describes how the road trips her characters embark on start out as an escape from responsibility and a search for a missing father figure who will miraculously solve the characters' problems. But inevitably, the story's narrators find that they are traveling to find themselves and their own inner strength. In this chapter, I also contrast the male-oriented road novel, think for instance of Jack Kerouac's On the Road, with these very much family female-oriented road trips, complete with felt markers and diapers and Barbie dolls and squabbles in the back seat. So Miriam Toews in her road trip novels is almost challenging the traditional road trip narrative by saying, it's okay if you're single and you have no children, but. So that's my second chapter. My third chapter looks at the dangers of fundamentalism in two of her books. Toews was raised in a Mennonite community, so her attack on fundamentalism focuses, some might say unfairly, on the Mennonite religion. But Toews is more interested in critiquing manifestations of fundamentalism in all its forms, be it religion, patriarchy, or even the Canadian healthcare system. In my third chapter, I look at Toews' complicated relationship with the Mennonite diaspora through her novel Irma Voth, set in Mexico, and Women Talking, set in Bolivia. As Mel Toews says in Swing Low, the Mennonites have a long history of moving from place to place, and that includes Canada, of course, in search of religious freedom and to escape persecution for their beliefs. But in Women Talking and Irma Voth, abuse comes from within the community itself, and the women must find the strength to once again leave their settlements to escape persecution. A character in Women Talking, Greta, asks her family and friends, how many times will we pack our bags and disappear into the night? Toews, however, shows that although the women must leave their abusive homes, they take the best parts of their faith with them. When freed from the shackles of patriarchy, there is much in religion which provides solace. In its purest form, free from the impulses of domination which seem to plague so much of human life, religious faith can also be a form of resilience. Finally, in my fourth chapter, I address Toews' two most biographical works through the concept of autofiction. Swing Low a Life is Toews' tribute to her father and her way of coping with her father's death by suicide. In other words, by creating Swing Low, Toews is writing her way toward resilience. Similarly, in All My Puny Sorrows, Toews gives a thinly veiled account of her sister Marjorie's death by suicide in 2010. As British writer Jeanette Winterson has said, quote, when we write, we offer the silence as much as the story. Words are the part of silence that can be spoken. In other words, autofiction, the clothing of the author's autobiographical story in the mantle of fiction, is a way to reframe traumatic events through maintaining artistic distance. Death by suicide is a personal silencing, but it also tends to silence others through grief, feelings of guilt, and the stigma that still unfortunately exists around the subject. By writing about her father's and sister's deaths, Toews brings the topic of mental illness into the light. Her compassionate and loving accounts of her family stretch the limits of fiction towards fact, but such an approach gives Toews the room to write and to heal. You might have noticed that I've described 8 books in this introduction, but in fact, Toews has written 9. And really, when I was finished the first draft, I got an email from Miriam Toews saying, my new book, Fight Night, is coming out in August 2021. And I went, that's wonderful, a new book by Toews. And then I went, oh dear, a new book by Toews. Because then I decided I wanted to, write about that book as well, because then I would have a complete discussion of her works to date. So I waited for the book to come out in August of 2021. I read it and I was amazed and impressed with it, as I am with all her works. And I also noticed that it was kind of a summing up of the theme of resilience in her work. In that book, she concentrates on her mother, Elvira. And the title character of the book, the grandma, is actually called Elvira. So she uses her mother's actual name. And she said of her mother that she is the epitome of resilience. And you see that in the book. So I felt like it was a nice rounding out of what I'd been talking about in the book as a whole. And I'd like to end with a quotation from Fight Night, from Grandma Elvira, who says of her town's religious leaders. They took our life force, and so we fight to reclaim it. We fight and we fight and we fight. We fight to love. We fight to love ourselves. We fight for access to our feelings, for access to our fires. If that's not a good description of resilience, I don't know what is. And thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to questions if you have any. Thank you.
Thanks so much. I have a lot of questions myself, so I will try to organize them into some kind of, answerable format. I'd like to start by asking you about your writing process. As you alluded to, one of the perils of working with a living author, which is that they keep producing. And like Shakespeare, if you're writing on Shakespeare, you don't have that problem, right? That's kind of, closed book for now. But there's certain elements of, terror, I suppose, speaking for myself, because you never know what that person's going to do. Are they going to phone you in the middle of the night and tell you, you got everything wrong in chapter 7, or what's going to happen? So I know that you spoke with Miriam Toews as you were writing the book, and you talked about how you sadly had to cancel your interview with her in person in March of 2020, when, as we know, March of 2020 was just like down the drain all around. So can you talk a little bit about your work with Miriam Toews and how that went, and also sort of how much authority you gave her words? You as a scholar are coming to her works with certain ideas. Is she the authority, or how do you feel about that?
Well, I found Miriam Toews to be incredibly gracious. When I thought about the project to start with, I emailed her through her publisher, and she wrote back. The first thing she said was, "It's amazing, the publisher actually sent your email along to me." And then she said, "I'm so excited that you're working on me, and thank you very much." And from then on, she was so cooperative and helpful. She answered my questions by email. And as Alison alluded to, I was all ready to go and see her in March 2020. My hotel was booked. I had my plane reservation, and then of course, COVID. So unfortunately, I still haven't met her in person because I was in Toronto this past summer, but she was in Sedona. And we had a lovely, though, online interview where she gave me a lot of answers to a lot of questions that I had. And I've just found her a delight to work with. So I guess that's the benefit of a living author, is that you can ask them questions. In terms of who is the authority on her work, I am the authority on my opinion, but she's obviously the authority on her own words. And I don't think we always have agreed completely. I think I take, for instance, a harsher stance on August Epp in Women Talking than she would, since she told me the character's based on her father. And in the book, I wrote a bit about how I thought he interjected too much in the female conversation. So there's a place where we had a slight difference of opinion, but I feel like my work is an interpretation based on talking with Miriam, trying to be as careful about her words as I can, but also giving my own individual take as a writer and critic.
So interesting. So one of the things you mentioned fairly early on in your book was that Miriam Toews, the living author, right, had the opportunity to revise her early work. Yes. So she published her first 2 novels and then went back and reworked some of them. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the kind of revisions that she made and what that shows about perhaps the development of her thinking or her creative process, or what was she revising towards?
Well, she had 2 books published before Swing Low a Life came out. And then, of course, A Complicated Kindness came out, and it won the Governor General's Award. And so the 3 earlier books were all republished because obviously she had then a much greater reputation. Summer of My Amazing Luck was only a bit revised. She took out a few statements. She took out what I call the Pink House incident, which is how her father was pressured to sell the house he loved better than anything to a car dealership in Steinbach. And that appears in 2 of her novels and in one of her essays. But it also appeared in Summer of My Amazing Luck. And I think she took it out partly because Swing Low had it in as well. And so it was 2 books in a row that had the same incident. She revised A Boy of Good Breeding a lot, though. One of the things she did was take out the cutesy names. So she called the character who gives birth to triplets Bertha Plenty in the first version. And then I think she thought better of it and made the name less punning and kind of silly. She cut down a lot of the backstory. So you see her, I think, thinking to herself that it wasn't all necessary, that she could make the book more concise. So those were the main things that she did, but it's only those 2 books that she revised, and I used the more recent versions of both.
Mm-hmm. Because those were closer to her own intentions, that's why you used those ones?
Yes, I think if she went to the trouble of revising them, then she must have revised them for a reason.
Yeah, it's hard to think about, I guess, as an author, having the opportunity to do that. Most authors don't, and what a terrifying prospect it must be to go back and look at your previously published work and have to confront it again on the page after you thought perhaps it was all put away and done with. Mm-hmm. So you mentioned Swing Low, and I want to ask you about the autofiction that you described near the end of your own book. And maybe you could say a little bit about what autofiction is, just to begin with. And then with some of the charges, I guess, that have been, well, not charges necessarily, but some of the maybe controversies or sticking points that have arisen when people discuss Miriam Toews is her very close adherence to real life, I suppose, like to the intimate details of her family life, her father, for example, her sister, and so on, and like the way in which she's able to transform that in a literary way onto the page, but the question remains for some people whether, is that right? Is it an invasion of privacy? Should one tell the stories of someone who cannot correct those stories? And yeah, that's a big topic, but please say something.
Yeah, I addressed that in my book, partly through the concept of the vulnerable subject, which is a term that a critic named Kusser uses. And he talks about the fact that some subjects don't have the ability to speak back. He is particularly talking about people who are deceased or people who, like children who have, say, severe physical or mental disabilities, and their parents write about them. And he says it's not really fair because you're taking someone's life and you're writing about it. And so that's something I had to grapple with when I'm looking at Toews. And these 2 books, especially Swing Low a Life and All My Puny Sorrows, one based on her father and the other on her sister, both who died by suicide. Autofiction to me is a very close reading of the author's life, but it's presented as fiction. So it's both auto, as in self, but fiction. But in Toews's case, as she herself admits, it's very close. So she said in an interview that her discussion of Elf von Riesen in All My Puny Sorrows was very similar to what happened to her sister Marjorie Toews. And so she is aware of that connection. I think partly that what she does is she writes to distance, because the death by suicide, as I say in the book, has more than one person affected by it. So the person who dies obviously has had incredible pain and suffering and feels that they cannot go on. But that leaves people behind with questions and a lot of grief and sometimes the need to rewrite the story of the person who has died. And so I think that's what Miriam Toews is trying to do. She's trying to understand what made these two people that she loved so deeply do something that, especially in the case of Marjorie, she actively tried to prevent. I think for her, the father's death by suicide was more of a shock. But with Marjorie, as the story suggests, she spent a lot of time trying to convince her not to, visiting her in mental health facilities. So she uses autofiction almost as a kind of therapeutic way of writing back to the people she has lost. And yes, you could consider it to be a violation of that person's privacy. And in both cases, especially her father, they hid their mental illness. Her father was very gregarious outside of the home and then came home and never spoke, which must have been very traumatic for her growing up, I would think. So she writes out, in some ways with her father, the life she wished she'd had with him. And with her sister, she writes about that relationship as a way to heal, as a kind of coping with grief to me. And therefore, the other thing I would say is it's a relational life. So sometimes when you write a autobiographical work, there's a person in your life who has been very shaping to it, so much so that you can't write about your own life without writing about that person, because who you are is intertwined with who they are. And I think that is also part of what Toews is doing.
Right. Do you see that as something unique to Toews? Like, do you see her as a, I guess, if we can imagine a sort of spectrum of fiction, with autofiction, like extreme autofiction on one end, and then I suppose extreme non-autofiction on the other end, just writing sort of like stuff that's just like straight up made up. Like, would you say that she's like, is she exceptional in her treatment of autofiction? Is that something which is unique to her, or is that part of a larger trend, do you think?
I think it's part of a larger trend, but Miriam Toews definitely has an autobiographical impulse in her work, and she has used images of her father ever since her first novel, frankly. That withdrawn, quiet man who doesn't speak appears in Summer of My Amazing Luck. It appears in A Boy of Good Breeding and in Swing Low. So she really does base a lot of her writing on her own experiences. But if you look at, say, a writer like Alice Munro, she doesn't say that she does, but the people in her small town sure thought she did. And she even writes a couple of stories where an author comes back and people are hurt because of what that she's written about them. So I think it's also part of being an author. You write about what you know, and what you know is your own experience. So I think a lot of times people do write from an autobiographical perspective. Just some people hide it better and aren't quite so precise about there's that connection.
Right. So one of the things that I was struck by when I was reading your book was your discussion of her as, I don't know whether an advocate is the right word, but certainly one of the advocate is for mental health services and the way the healthcare system treats people who are in crisis. And I mean, I think we often think about Miriam Toews as somebody who is, I guess, a political writer in a very broad sense, in that, in critiquing fundamentalism, she's examining the way power works and so on in all kinds of different ways. But I hadn't thought of her as a sort of a political writer in this kind of sense, like I guess a more hands-on, kind of immediate, like a real politics sort of sense. And I'm wondering if you could say a little bit about her as a political writer. Like, do you see her as a political writer?
I do, to a certain extent, yes, because she is always looking at power structures, and she is critiquing both individuals and institutions that keep power at the top and don't let it filter down. So I've talked a lot about, patriarchal fundamentalist church groups, and how in the case, say, of A Complicated Kindness, Toews deals with shunning, a particularly horrible practice where someone is literally shunned from the group to which they belong. That is a controversial subject. Some people say that it doesn't exist the way she talks about it existing, and she says, yes, it does. But so that's one way that she's political. In terms of the mental health system, she has seen her father and her sister go through the system, and she takes the view that the mental health system is again controlled from the top and doesn't listen to its patients. Now, I think she's aware that part of the problem is monetary and that there just aren't enough people. And so the ideal system, I think, would be one that had more resources so that they could provide better care. But in her experience dealing with her sister and her father, it's a lot of rules and then condemnation when the person doesn't follow the rules, even though in a way, the diagnosis of mental illness implies that you're not quite able to follow the rules. So you're caught in this problem where you're judged on whether or not you're complying, but you're not really able to comply. So that's, I think, what she really gets angry about in her works and where she gets angry in interviews.
Yeah, and that really comes through. The energy that she has when talking about those topics really comes through in your writing about them as well. So there's obviously a very strong through line about resiliency in your study, which you look at it, appearing in a variety of different characters in a variety of different places and times, and sort of manifesting in a number of different ways. What did you learn about resiliency? Did anything surprise you, or what's, as a scholar examining it, what's new for you? What did you learn?
I think one thing I learned was that it's not always good to be resilient. Like, we think of resilience as this goal that everyone should have. And to a certain degree, of course, Toews herself is a very resilient person because she has overcome things that would have destroyed people who are less strong. And the same thing with her mother. She is someone who, as she's emailed to me on a couple of occasions, she values resilience very much. But sometimes if resilience is too strong, people can cut themselves off from saying no. So for instance, say, to use an example, there's a book called Grit, whose author's name I forget at the moment, but they're talking about the military system. And so someone in the military who just keeps going and going might be seen as resilient because they don't stop, but maybe they should stop and say, military is not for me. So sometimes there is that negative edge to resilience, even though I see it mainly as a positive, as something that gets people beyond the inevitable traumas that confront us all and allows us to grow and perhaps use that experience to shape a new way forward.
Right. Oh, well, I'd love to continue this. I do want to give the audience time to ask questions. So I have one final question for you, which is, what are you working on next? Now that you've got this beautiful book beside you, what's next for you?
Retirement, maybe. I don't know.
You and me both.
I'm not sure yet. I've spent the last few years really immersed in Miriam Toews, and I've enjoyed it so much. And there's so many little angles that I could keep going with, like the whole question of those 2 books that you revised.
Mm-hmm.
There's just all these little things that I could still write about, at least an article or whatever. So that's something I might be interested in, but I think it's too early because I'm still, the book came out on November 4th, and I've been totally immersed in this book.
Well, it's been a full, 3 weeks now. Come on.
Oh, yeah.
I can't believe there's no manuscript on the book already.
Well, unfortunately not.
Well, thank you so much for this conversation.
Thank you.
And I think I'm gonna have to call John back from behind the screen where he's maybe to take over.
Absolutely. So just a reminder, if you do have a question, please feel free to put your hand up and I'll wander over to you with the mic. And if you are watching on YouTube and have a question, just write it in the chat. We'll get to you. Were there any questions? All questions may have been satisfied by the conversation that you folks had. Our online listeners are also a little bit quiet at the moment. I'm not sure if you had anything further at all, Alison, or?
Nothing I care to have broadcast over the microphone. Thank you very much.
That is entirely reasonable. Yes, and we have a question over here.
I get to use the mic. Great. Hi, thanks for the talk. I guess I'm wondering, given the amount of love there is for Miriam Toews, you know, across the reading public, did you feel like you were intervening in anything? Were there any like sort of narratives around Miriam Toews or ways that critics or, you know, reviewers have sort of responded to her work that you felt you needed to correct? Or do you see yourself more like, I guess, on the same wavelength as the reading public in terms of reception of Miriam Toews?
Well, I'm definitely a big admirer of her work. And one thing I didn't really talk about was her amazing humor and how, you know, she can take the most dire subjects and make them funny. So even as you are, you know, crying, you're also laughing, and you sometimes, at least I feel like, oh, maybe I shouldn't be laughing. And yet she has this intense humor that I love. The one that I thought I needed to intervene perhaps on was the whole subject, as you say, of life writing and taking the father's voice, which, you know, when I presented an early paper to my department, actually, we had this series of, you know, this is my research talks. And people got very upset when they found out that Miriam Toews had written Swing Low using the I voice of her father. And so I really started thinking, why did she do that? And I wanted to really think through the use of that voice, because she could have done the whole thing as he, but she chose not to. And she gives it, as you might know, in the front of Swing Low, she gives a reason for that. But I felt like I wanted to really understand why she would do that the way she did. Yeah.
Were there any other questions from the audience? All right. Well, there will be an opportunity to ask further questions as well if you do join us at the signing thereafter. I'll be back in just a moment to offer some signing procedure notes, but if you folks have any closing comments you might like to make, please feel free to go ahead.
Oh, well, I would love to thank Alison for being here and asking me such wonderful questions. It was a delight to talk with you. And I'd also like to thank both the people in the audience and anyone watching online. Hi, Mom, I know you're out there. But yes, I'd just like to say thank you for coming and for our mutual appreciation of this wonderful author. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And thank you both once again. So we will be moving along to the signing now. So in just a moment, we will transport Sabrina just across the store to a table just beside our cash desk. There'll be copies of the book available at that table. There are copies of the book available behind our cash desk also. You can get a copy of the book signed before you pay for it. Please do pay for the book. Otherwise, once again, we are so very grateful to the University of Manitoba Press for helping to bring this evening together. So grateful to Alison Calder for her inimitable hosting. It's always such a pleasure to have her behind a microphone again. And of course, to Sabrina Reed for writing this work and giving us a reason to gather, and for being one of the first to truly examine the work of one of our most beloved authors. We're also grateful to all of you for joining us here this evening. So thank you all so very much, both here and virtually. I hope you all have a wonderful night. Thank you again.